This video contains mature subject matter. It's recommended for viewers 18 and over only. Some of this stuff is creepy. So, what are we talking about today? We are talking about revenants. What makes a revenant worth talking about? They're an undead body that animates from the grave and wanders the earth. Draugr, as they call them in Skyrim, walkers. Okay, now they're not your typical zombie slash ghoul that mindlessly wanders the earth trying to eat people or eat brains. A revenant can also be a vampire, but usually what a revenant is an undead corpse that has risen from its grave and it has a mission. It's vindictive, it's got a purpose, and it's intelligent and it'll talk to you and it'll beat you up and it's a monster. It's a intelligent, almost sentient undead monster. And that's why we're talking about them today. We're not talking about the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where he fights the bear and barely survives and does his thing. That's a revenant would be a good way to describe him and metaphorically, but we're talking about accounts of supposedly real revenants from the 12th century. Okay, these stories are included in the histories of the regions, and we're going to review some of those stories. So let me get that loaded for you. Now, while we're reviewing these stories, I'm going to show you some slides that are pretty cool and pretty creepy, and I'm going to hope that you enjoy those slides. But let me get this fired up for you, and we can start with the revenant stories. What is a revenant? I described that in a minute ago, but in the 12th century, around 1136, there was a man named William Newburgh. That's when he was born. He lived 1136, 1198. He recounts stories of revenants in the area, and he talks about them, and they wander the countryside, causing terror and trying to cause the destruction of the living, and then at night returning to the tomb where the graves spontaneously open up and take the revenant back inside. He recounts the story of one particular man, a man of what they call evil conduct. And this man of evil conduct suspected his wife of cheating on him. So he hid in the rafters of their home, and sure enough, she caught him cheating with a younger guy. And in a rage, he jumped down to, attack them. And he, in the process, mortally wounded himself and was buried. Well, they gave him a Christian burial. They probably shouldn't have, they said, but they did. And then at night, the grave would open up, the corpse would rise, and he would wander around the village and the courts and the houses, as it said, um, basically beating people black and blue and yelling and screaming, and a pack of dogs followed him, and he was causing just general mayhem and destruction and terror. People wouldn't go about their business at night. They'd lock the doors as the sun went down and not unlock them until the sun came back up, because he was there. Eventually it got bad. He was actually killing people in the town. So the men of the town and the old men, they went out to the grave. They dug the grave open, and there was the body of this man of ill conduct, evil conduct, and he was swollen and corpulent, like fat, swollen fat. And they plunged their shovels into him, and their pitchforks and all that kind of thing. Blood spurted out of him like a leech, like a leech that had just fed on a human. Sounds similar to some vampire stories, doesn't it? But this guy wasn't turning people into vampires. They cut the body to bits, they burned the bits, and then they never had a problem with the guy again. Some even say they put in like an iron cage, like they did with the vampires, over his grave so he couldn't rise. But there's nothing left there. It was burned up. His body was burned up. Um, Another story that the same guy, Mr. William of Newburgh, tells us is about a woman whose husband died, and she was distraught. But they buried him, and then for 3 nights, the corpse of the man would rise from the grave and come to his wife's bed chambers, and he would lay upon her, and he was so heavy she couldn't move him. And this happened, and for 3 nights in a row. And as William Newburgh describes it, he thus became like a serious nuisance, eventually extending his walks to broad daylight around the village. Eventually, the problem was solved by the Bishop of Lincoln, who wrote a letter of absolution, upon which it was placed in the man's tomb, and when it was opened and his body was there, and the letter was actually placed on this chest of the man doing this, the dead husband, and the tomb was sealed, and this letter of absolution corrected things. He no longer no longer rose from the dead and went to bed with his wife. So that's an interesting story, and it includes the clergy in the history of this story. Another one is a story actually told by a clergyman called the Abbot of Burton, and talked about two runaway peasants, and this was about from 1090, who died suddenly of unknown causes. They buried the young men, and that very night, after they buried him, the two young men they rose from the dead and would carry their coffins around and through the paths and the fields of the village, and they would bang on doors, and they appeared usually as young men carrying coffins. Sometimes they looked like bears or dogs. Okay, they spoke to the other peasants, banging on the walls of their houses and shouting, "Move quickly, move, get going, come!" And what was disturbing, even more so disturbing than this, was the villagers became sick and started dying, and eventually the bodies of the revenants were exhumed, their heads cut off, and their hearts removed, which ended the spread of the sickness in that town. And this is recorded by the Abbot of Burton, a clergyman from that area. Not exactly a tourist attraction, and it makes you wonder why this was stories there in the regular history of that area of Burton. Um, the next man I talk about is a guy named Walter Mapp. Walter Mapp was a Welshman, and he basically describes the tale of a wicked man in Hereford who revived from the dead and wandered the streets of his village, calling out the names of those who would die of sickness within 3 days. The response by Bishop Guilford, or not Bishop Guilford, the response by Bishop Gilbert Folliot was to dig up the body and cut off the head with a spade and sprinkle it with holy water and then rebury it. That seemed to fix it, but that was think about that. You have an undead guy, you have a monster that rises from the grave, wanders the town, and calls out the names of people, and then 3 days later they die of illness. Can you imagine sitting in your living room, watching YouTube? I think they had YouTube in the 12th century or something there. I think back then it was just they only had 3 channels. But anyway, they would sitting there and you hear your name called, and knowing in 3 days you're gonna die. That's no fun. But this was included by Walter Mapp, a Welshman chronicling the history of the area, and included a known clergyman, Gilbert I got Folliot. I hope I'm saying that name right. He was a bishop. So this is why I found revenants interesting in this particular case, is because we have these records of them basically doing their thing. They uh, recounted in these stories. So once I saw these stories the first time, I thought these are really interesting. I wonder if they're true. I don't know if they're true. Um, Obviously, none of us do, and we're not going to be able to figure that out. But anyhow, I wanted to talk about that today. I wanted to give you guys some of these cool stories. Next time, I'm going to be talking to more stuff that's going on around here in the house, more haunting fun, it seems, and see what you guys think about that. But before I go, I would invite you, if you enjoyed the content, make a comment and it helps keep me going. Also, you can go to my link and check out some of my cool stuff. I've got some um, excuse me. I've got some fun stuff out there for sale on my Etsy store. I got some cool T-shirts. I got there's Jason. I got some cool coffee mugs. Uh, Here's my Revenant coffee mug. He knows what he's on. Like I said, usually they have a mission. This one's just coffee. So these are a few things you can go out there and buy if you feel so inclined. Anyway, enough of that. You know what, guys? I am really happy you listened, and thank you for being here. And I'm going to see you next time with some more haunting stories. And when things get cleared up around here a little bit, we're going to start taking some road trips to some haunted areas right around here, or paranormal areas. Neon Wrangler, from any living from Alaska to Georgia and parts in between and parts unknown, thank you for stopping by.